Okay, good morning and thank you, Jane. So let me go ahead and share the presentation screen. So hopefully you can all see that now. So we gave the title of today's presentation, Art, Archives, and the Spaces in Between. Partly because we are Asia Art Archive, so it makes sense to talk about art and archives, but the emphasis really is kind of on maybe the spaces in between, and what that means hopefully will become clearer during the course of our talk today. And so first of all, let me say that it's a huge honor and a thrill to be invited by IDS program. So thank you very much, Omar and Leslie, for enabling making possible this joint presentation by Jane and myself. I think this is actually the first time we're doing a joint talk, so this is great that we get to do this. And I'm going to start a little eccentrically in the sense that rather than kind of do a straightforward presentation of, hold on, let me see. Okay, there we go. Rather than do a straightforward, just launch into a presentation of Asia Art Archive, I'm going to start here actually with this op-ed that was published in the South China Morning Post, which is the local English paper of Hong Kong. And partly because it's about Hong Kong at this very particular moment in history, when it's kind of post-pandemic or since the pandemic, and also since 2019 and the national security legislation, and there's been a lot of back and forth and various editorializing about what Hong Kong should and shouldn't do, and should and shouldn't be. But it's not so much the content of what was being kind of touted in the headline as it is the writer, Christine Low, that caught my eye, because actually Christine Low is someone who is represented rather substantially actually in Asia Art Archive's collection, and specifically in an archive called the Out of Context Research Project, which concerns an exhibition that took place in 1987. So in other words, 3 years after the handover signing off between the UK and China about the return of Hong Kong in 1997. And Christine was one of the organizers of Out of Context, the project. She was at the time worked in finance, and but was very much interested in art and connected with many artists. And so they had the idea to do this project, as you can see from one of the files, an art exhibition in an old house. And it literally was an old house that because at the time there was not really any available venue for contemporary art. And so Christine helped the artists organize this project. And one way of understanding, projects or events such as Out of Context is through the artwork. And I think that if we're talking about, if we were a museum, for instance, one of the things that we would focus on is precisely the artwork, right? So I'm showing you here 2 of the artwork that were presented in Out of Context. So on the left, an installation by the artist Choi Yan-zi, who was born in Hong Kong, but actually came to the US to study before returning back to Hong Kong, and is generally credited as being the first installation-based artist to have introduced installation as a kind of a format to Hong Kong. And then Ricky Young, who did a performance called Man in Cage that you see on the right. And so that would be the kind of like the museum approach, right? To look at what was the artwork that was presented there and kind of take things from there. But because Asia Art Archive is an archive, the approach that we have is maybe a little more encompassing. So in fact, those 2 artwork you can see on our website are in the kind of midst of various other documents. And here you can see the screen, if you were, and one thing I should note is that Asia Archive has an online collection and you can go and view that. where it's next to ephemera, press clippings, and other material that contextualizes both of those performances, right? And so that tells you something, and that includes the material related to Christine Lowe, the editorialist that I showed, whose editorial I showed you at the start. And you can see here a very young Christine Lowe in her advocate for the arts mode, talking about the need to have a kind of a cultural identity for Hong Kong. And I should note that, this is part of a larger movement that began in the 1980s, I think at precisely the moment when Hong Kong was nearing the end of its 100-year lease and thinking about what was going to be next. And I think it was kind of like that twilight moment when something crystallizes and a very distinctly Hong Kong identity begins to form. Because one thing to understand about Hong Kong is that most of the inhabitants are not from here. And especially after the communist China kind of crystallized, then there were many people who moved to Hong Kong from mainland China. And so the first kind of arrivals didn't think of themselves as Hong Kongers per se, and it was only kind of this generation that really began to think of itself as a distinctly Hong Kong, right? And that's kind of a process that continues, I think, still. And also, I think, resulted in the founding of Asia Art Archive in 2000. And so it was co-founded by 3 people in Hong Kong, only one of whom I think was actually born here, but all of whom actually are really deeply rooted in Hong Kong society. And when it was founded in 2000, it was meant, as Leslie pointed out, to address kind of things that were not being, histories and things that were not being addressed or available, accessible in other venues. And in fact, one of the founders had been, Claire Sue, had been a student at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and Asian Studies. I use the word Oriental advisedly, but that's the name of the school. And she wanted to work on contemporary art of China, but there was not really any resources even at SOAS. And so I think, AA came out of that kind of sense that there was needed to be a place where material could be gathered. And so when it was started, it began as a library, and you can see the original, well, one of the original earlier incarnations of the library with these orange chairs. And this is the space that we still occupy, but it's just been recently renovated. And so it looks completely different, but we haven't officially opened yet. So I'm sharing with you the older picture of the space. But you can see all of the books. And when it started, it literally was just one shelf of books, and it grew from there to encompass a variety of different materials, including exhibition catalogs, monographs, but also ephemera and clipping collections, CDs, and periodicals. And also archives, right? The name Asia Art Archive relates to that part of it. And there are physical archives that are on site. But one thing to understand about Asia Art Archive is that the physical collections are actually only one distinct part of the collection, important but very kind of limited, in the sense that Asia Art Archive also took upon itself very quickly thereafter, so starting about 2003, 2004, to really be documenting contemporary art as it was happening. And one thing to understand for people who may be less familiar with contemporary art in Asia is that as a phenomena, it really took off in the 1990s, right? And there were highlight events such as the Guangzhou Biennale or the Taipei Biennial and other events which were well known, but there wasn't really so much kind of, so many institutions or venues for contemporary art. It was only in the 1990s that really started to kind of grow. And so in the 2000s, there were still relatively limited numbers of activities, and Asia Art Archive actually did have the ambition to document as much of that as possible. And so on the left, you can see research logs, which were published on its original website and now have been migrated to its current website. But a research log by Claire, one of the co-founders, about the scene in Shenzhen, for instance. And you can see actually Jane in the photos on the right, in this little photo here. And so, our founders, and Jane joined in 2003 as a board member, but everyone was very hands-on in the way that they were documenting art as it was happening. So the archive that we were talking about at that point was an archive that was very much created by AAA, as we affectionately like to call ourselves. But about 12 years ago, I think there was a realization that maybe there were others who were also archiving that history and earlier histories. And maybe that wasn't necessarily, that AA didn't need to do all of the archiving itself. And that's when we began working with what we call research collections, but which could also be understood as archives that are mostly received by AA from other sources. And so what you see here is the landing page for the research collections on the left. And you can see currently we have 47 collections. And we'll be hearing about a few of them, including Betsy Damon, which is the first one here. And on the right, I'm showing you just the kind of a graphic that gives you a sense of our collections, because I think, on the one hand, as I mentioned, we have a library collection, most of which is on site and which makes sense for, a library, but also our research collections. And this may be the surprising part, is that, the archives are mostly online. So we actually digitize our collections, but we do not take the physical papers for the most part. Almost all of the materials are only available online. And then some of the material, even though it is digitized for copyright or privacy reasons, we keep on site only because there may be issues with access. And so there's some material which you need to come to Hong Kong or else to AA in America in New York or our India office to take a look at that material. And so, all this to say is that AA as a collection, is very much a hybrid one between the physical and the online, but all of which is, as Leslie pointed out, is there to make accessible the different strands in the history of Asia and of the recent history, right? But we don't cover all of Asia because that would itself be kind of impossible at this point for recent histories of art. And so we have what we call content priorities, and I'm showing you the list of them here. There are, we start off with 5. The content priorities kind of approach was something that was developed in the midst of our digital project, a digitization project of archives. And so when we were doing that, we defined a number of them, and we have innovation through tradition, complex geographies, performance, women and gender diversity, and an umbrella category called sites of construction, which are basically areas or subfields, maybe you can think of within a larger history of art and visual culture that were places where the art histories of the region could be found, And so I think one kind of truism about contemporary art is that, the history of contemporary art is written through its exhibitions. And because we're dealing with the recent art histories of Asia, we definitely are interested in exhibition histories because much of that is where art encounters its public, as our collaborators at After All likes to kind of define what an exhibition is and what an exhibition does. But another place where art encounters a public of some kind is art pedagogy. In other words, art schools, and where people learn art, learn to make art, learn to be artists. art writing, which is, of course, is the reception, deals with the reception of art by critics, but also for a reading public. And then more recently, we formally announced independent art spaces as one of the kind of priorities that we are focusing on. Today, we're going to look at two of those. Performance, which is maybe a genre that exists because it's ephemeral, exists really most pointedly in the archive, in archives, and also women and gender diversity, which Jane will be addressing. And so maybe at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Jane.
Thank you very much, John. That was a great overview and a great sort of march through a very a nice long history, of which I've been very honored to be part of for the majority of it. What I'm going to talk about right now is Betsy Damon Archive. And the Betsy Damon Archive is special for many, many reasons. And it's a fairly new archive that we brought in. It was launched in 2018, and it is fully available except for a fraction of the material online. And that material online you can access either, as John said, that the material that isn't online you can access here in New York, in Brooklyn, which is where I am right now, or in Hong Kong. But the question first is who is Betsy Damon? Doesn't sound like an Asian. She is in fact an artist, an activist, and a feminist who works with performance. And in the 1980s, thank you, John, in the 1980s was an active performance artist. And here is two pictures of her doing a performance in Lower Manhattan in 1997 called The 7,000-Year-Old Woman. In the 1980s, she turned her focus to environmental degradation, in particular water pollution and preservation. And John, maybe we can look at the next one. And in 1991, she founded something called Keepers of the Water, which is a community-based water activism initiative founded and directed by Betsy, which continues to be extremely active even today. Betsy is based in Brooklyn. Keepers of the Water, under the auspices of Keepers of the Water, Betsy went, well, she didn't go under the auspices, but she went to China in the early 1990s for personal reasons, but ended up organizing two events that contained or exhibited a lot of performance under the auspices of Keepers of the Water. One event was in Chengdu, China, which is in Sichuan, China, in the southwest part of China, and that was in 1995. The other took place in Lhasa, Tibet in 1996. And again, it was to raise awareness around water pollution and water protection. This archive contains about 500 individual pieces of material, 225 records. It has slides, it has audio-visual materials, newspaper clippings, exhibition ephemera, interviews, handmade posters, letters, proposals, all sorts of really interesting material. But what's so special about it? First of all, it's really full of surprises from my perspective. And I think I'd like to say from the perspectives of many long-term scholars and students of China. Much of this exciting material is new to us, and it was unpublished. The material is also not only rich and interesting in its own right, but it expands and complicates and disturbs the story of Chinese contemporary art that was and continues to be circulated in the mainstream history books, in the media, and in the Western imagination. Here are some examples. John, we can go to the next one. These two events that Betsy Damon catalyzed. She says she's not a curator. She doesn't like the idea of being an organizer. She's very undirective in her practice and methodology. But she catalyzed this two events, one in Chengdu and one in Lhasa in Tibet. And here's a map. most of the work, most of the artwork that we see today, most of the artists that we know that are circulating in international exhibitions and publications and the art market are happening in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. And they are on the map right here. They're coastal cities. They are major cities and the ones that most non-Chinese would know about. But these two events happened in interior China, one in Chengdu, that John is circulating right now, and one in Lhasa, Tibet. And this archive is a testimony to the vibrant and active art scenes that were happening in the 1990s at that time, and really more or less undocumented or uncirculated or exposed in the history books and by curators and critics at the time. Another commonly held narrative about contemporary Chinese art was that after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989, experimental art and performance art in particular was banned in China. But you can go to the next slide. Here we have a very public city, municipal government endorsed and sponsored project, a performance art. I'm not going to call it a festival. I don't think she would have called it that, but an event that focused on raising community engagement and awareness of issues around protecting the rivers, the water in the rivers that flowed through Chengdu city and Lhasa in Tibet. So here's a banner and a march and parade through the city of Chengdu in 1995, and the banner names the keepers of the water in Chinese, as well as the Chengdu Municipal Environmental Protection Bureau. Next. And in this exhibition, or in this event, there were many installations and performances. Again, relatively unknown in the annals, the commonly circulated annals of China at the time. But here's a site-specific participatory installation by Dai Guanyu, where photographs of participants are soaked in river water and degrade over the course of the multi-day event. Next. Here's one called Washing Silk. You have a number of artists coming together on the banks of the river, washing strips of white silk cloth in the river to show how it stained or became dirty over the course of the washing. Next. Then we have work by Wang Peng, where he borrows jugs, pots from the local merchants or shopkeepers, fills them with fresh water and ostensibly live fish, and suspends them over the dirty river in which the fish no longer thrive or survive. Next, we have another work by an artist, sadly, who's passed away, by the name of Datong Da Zhang, where he suspends brooms from a bridge, and this one is happening in Lhasa, in a metaphorical attempt to clean the river. It's called Sweeping River. All of these really compelling installations and performances were previously unpublished and, underexposed, or at least underexposed. I didn't know about them, which isn't to say that other people didn't, but let's put it this way. It was news to me as a long-term scholar. The next one, however, was much better known. This work I did know about, and in fact, it led me to Betsy. It's an artist named In Xiaozhen, a woman. It's called Washing River. It's a relatively well-known work, or it's extremely well-known work in the Chinese art community. It's been widely published in still photography, and it is mostly published, or it's mostly shown, if not always shown, without the people around it. And this was, the artist made this event by creating large cubes of water from blocks of ice made from the dirty Funan River in Chengdu, and inviting passersby to wash it. And in Betsy Damon's archive is this wonderful clip. It's a much longer clip. We'll only show a minute of it, of of way she invited the community who was walking by to wash this river. This is on a main street in Chengdu.
来到这时就跟我说了一下，就是这个河水污染的问题。围绕这个呢，说大家都应该做点什么。不管你是干什么，我们呢是搞艺术的吧，可以这么说，所以要用艺术的方式来体现这种河水的污染。
以后我们国家也年年的这个发展嘛，发展了这个水就全成河水了，水。
That's in it, but basically she's saying that we artists need to do something about the water pollution. And then it's also important to notice that she's being interviewed by the local television station, and that all television stations, as well as radio and media in China, and particularly at that time, but again, I think we are seeing it again, are controlled by the government. The next slide is also extremely well-known artist by Song Dong, called Stamping the River. And this image, this piece of work is very well circulated, very well published, and actually very well collected by major museums in the United States. It appears this way in a series of photographs. And the Metropolitan, in fact, Metropolitan Museum here in New York has a copy of it. And just like in the previous work that we showed about washing the river, washing the blocks of ice in the river, in nowhere did I ever see a reference to the Performance Art Festival or the performance or the context in which this work was made. And again, in the archive, we do see another slide. Can we see that slide of the artist actually stamping the river from a different angle, so you get a very different sense of what's going on. There are multiple slides that show this. Another great revelation was in this archive, there are Tibetan artists, and not enough is known and still known about contemporary artists in Tibet, or contemporary artists by non-Han Chinese. There are many ethnic minorities in China. And this performance took place at the closing of the event in 1996 in Lhasa, when a group of people, Tibetans, came together to erect crosses along the riverbank on which were hung white T-shirts. And at the ends of the T-shirts end of these horizontal stakes on which the T-shirts were hung were lanterns that lit up at night as night fell. It's a very beautiful video. And again, art from Tibet, and particularly art of this kind, was of total revelation to us. You can take the video. Another big gap in our archive, we must acknowledge, and in the history of Chinese contemporary art, is the lack of women artists, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, and even up through the early 2000s. That's changed, but it was really something that was quite apparent at the time. This archive, very interestingly, includes a good number of artists previously underexposed, including Chinese and Tibetan women artists, of which Incho-Jun, and this is an image, Incho-Jun is the woman who did the washing the river, and this is another image from that where she fills shoes with yak butter. The next. This is an image of a work by Zhang Lei called Noble Knowing, where she laid white strips of white cloth, silk cloth, along the banks of the Lhasa River to honor the water. Next. Here's another artist. Again, these are not at all well known and really have been sort of in some ways become invisible in the archive or in the history. This is a woman named Zhang Xin, who covers the main highway that heads up through Tibet in soil, and is in the process of sowing seeds. Next. And here is a Tibetan woman artist named Suri Lamu, who was creating a burial site for fish that she was going to float down the river. Now, all this material, next, John, all this material is available on our website in the Betsy Damon archive, as you can see on the screen. And what is quite exciting about it, it has spawned multiple programs, scholarly research, curatorial projects. John, we can talk about that a little bit later, perhaps. But the last slide, please. I just want to end by thanking Betsy and the other organizers, including Dai Guan Yu, one of the local artists who was very active in this, and all the artists, many of whom are not adequately studied or known, who made this archive possible. Thank you. So John, you're next.
Thanks, Jane. So I think as Jane was made very clear, there's a very kind of specific, and thank you for that deep dive into Betsy Damon. I think that was really fascinating to hear, and I'm already seeing questions in the Q&A part for us. But I think as Jane made clear, there's, I think one of the particularities about the kind of collecting that Asia Art Archive does, and one, as I was suggesting earlier, one of the distinctions between the collecting that we do and the collecting that a museum would do is the thinking about context, and then thinking about kind of, as it were, casting the net wider. And so what I'm showing you here are two other performances that are not from China, but actually both by artists of or related to Singapore. So on the left, a performance called Brother Cain that was done by Joseph Ng shortly after midnight, New Year's Day, 1994, at an event called Artists General Assembly. And on the right, Li Wen, Journey of a Yellow Man. Li Wen was an artist from Singapore who went to study in the UK and did this performance called Journey of a Yellow Man, partly because he was being identified in response to people's identification of him as Chinese. And so, he wanted to kind of question this kind of flattening of Asianness with Chineseness. And so, the idea of being racially yellow, as it were. Both of these are now really kind of well-known pieces in the performance canon, if we can call it that, of Asia, and especially of Southeast Asia and Singapore. But I think, whereas a museum would be interested in kind of focusing on those, Asia Art Archive, when we have both of these pieces represented in our collections, it's within a larger context. And so you can see that photo I just showed you of Journey of the Yellow Man is part of a larger set of materials. So there's actually 38 photographs that form that record. But then also there are others within a whole kind of file or folder of material related to that first iteration. But then also part of a larger, and here I'm showing you the apparatus. Jane was mentioning the way that Betsy Damon is available on our website. It's available, archives are available on the website within a larger kind of a framework of what we call a tree structure, whereby the archive is organized. And you can see that there are a number of performance pieces that are documented, and those are all accessible within the Li Wen archive, as is material related to the context of Li Wen himself. So one of the things to understand about Li Wen is that he was very active as an organizer and as someone who participated in a number of festivals and organizations and collectives as well. And so, I don't know if you remember, but the performance pieces, there are about 300 records, but the art collectives, festivals, and organizations, there's 1,300 so far. We're still in the process of finalizing this archive. So, the numbers may be shifting somewhat in the next few weeks. But in other words, what the archive shows is the way that Li Wen as an artist anyway, was very much focused on not just preparing and making his own work, but also someone who was very much part of a broader community or coalition of artists who were there to promote performance as a kind of a practice. And I think that's one of the interesting things about these different practices that an archive can show that maybe a museum doesn't show as well, which is the way that an artist's life and artist's practice is about so much more, can be about so much more than the making of final work. And here you can see, some of the documents, including budgets for some of these performance festivals that Li Wen was a part of. And also included in this section is material from Li Wen and his own participation in Artists General Assembly, which was, of course, the event that I showed you earlier for Joseph Ng's brother Cain. Li Wen was one of the participating artists. But one of the interesting things about the archive is also that its material about specific artists are not always in their own archive. So in other words, Joseph Ng is not actually part of the Joseph Ng archive, and Li Wen material is available not just in Li Wen's own archive, but also in other people's archive. And so there's a broader network that is also documented in the archive in the way that, for instance, Christine Lowe is part of the Out of Context archive, right? So there's a way in which the archive, when it's a really kind of interesting one, is auto-contextualizing or self-contextualizing, right? And so, as I mentioned, Joseph Ng, in fact, his performance was one that led to a de facto ban on performance art as a kind of a genre in Singapore for a decade, right? But there's only one known video recording of it, and that's in the archive of another artist named Ray Langenbach, who, like Betsy Damon, was American, but who, in his case, settled in Malaysia and Singapore and was very active in documenting the work of other artists. And so through Ray's archive, we have one of the kind of the only known video recording of that seminal piece. And Ray's archive actually came to Asia Art Archive specifically because of another event that took place in the 2000s that caused Ray to be concerned about the possible confiscation of his archive. And so he approached Asia Art Archive about the possibility of safeguarding his material. And that kind of was part of the conversation that led to us as an organization thinking about collecting archives from others rather than just working on developing our own archive. And this is one of the things I think that's important to understand, is that the context of Asia is not just one in which, contemporary art is maybe a new format, but it's also one in which artists were making interventions in a larger sense within society, right? Civil society, as we understand it in the United States, is not necessarily something that is pertinent or active in the same way, or even possible in different parts of Asia, right? And so these events that are occurring are participating, are interventions not just in art, but also possibly in politics and society in a kind of much closer way than maybe would be possible in the United States. And what I'm showing you here is the kind of the full record for Brother Cane, and you can see that it was part of this larger event called Artists General Assembly. And on the right, the way that all of the metadata for that event, including the date, including where it took place, including the different artists, are represented in a map that we have of our event in our event database. So you can see on the top the over 27,000 events that are represented in Asia Art Archive's different archives. And then on the bottom, just from the 1990s, the events as they're taking place around the world. So this is a visualization of the different kind of events, including performances and exhibitions that are captured by the archive, right? But it's also a way of thinking about networks, because archives are actually traces, and this touches on, I think, one of the themes of what the IDS series is focusing on this term. The archives are traces of networks, right? And so in this case, this is a visualization of the network that's represented by the festivals, performance art festivals, and participating artists in Asia Archives collections. This was done by some of my colleagues in 2019. And you can see Li Wen in green connected with the various performance art festivals, right? And it's also something that we kind of explore, this question of the network, in our participation in Documenta, which focuses on 3 different kinds of collectives in our collections. And so one of them is Berrada, which the University of Berrada, which was a school that helped catalyze a certain kind of approach to thinking about vernacular cultures. But we're also interested in the performance art network. And you can see, the screens here that has that display some of the performances represented in our collections, including by Li Wen that you see on the lower left here. And here's a close-up of that, Li Wen on the lower left, and Joseph Ng's Brother Cane, which was on view on the lower right, as well as some others. And we also have posters related to some of the festivals, as well as on this screen, videos by Ray Longenbach showing not performances, but actually demonstrations on the street in Bangkok and in Jakarta. Bangkok during the kind of social unrest there in the 1990s, and then in Jakarta, what happened on the streets, the celebrations that took place after the downfall of Suharto. And so it was a kind of, this is like one of the moments when civil society kind of really becomes possible, when there's the end of a certain kind of regime, right? And in Ray's mind, according to Ray, if you talk to him, performance is not isolated in its own kind of corner, but is part of this larger phenomena of spontaneous and street performances, right, that take place. And so it's thinking about these different gamut or kind of range of performativity that takes place in everyday life. And according to him, that performance art is located in. So, it's not just about, these traces that Asia Archive is interested in, but also about the performances that take place that are captured, but also the disruptions that are possible, right? So in some ways, it's maybe a little sampling of all three kind of thematics that IDS is interested in. And it's something that Asia Archive itself, this question of thinking about these networks is something that Asia Archive itself is participates in, because after all, if we're part of Documenta, it's through the invitation of Good School, which is related to Rangrupa, both of whom are artist collectives that Asia Archive has collaborated with and is collaborating with. And among a number of other agents, both individual and collective, that AA has worked with and form a broader network. And so, and that includes the AA in America. And at this point, I'm going to hand things back to Jane for her to say a few words about the Brooklyn office, as it were.
Thank you again, John. That was very, it's nice and expansive. It opened up a lot of questions and ideas, I think. So thank you very much. So as I mentioned before, John is in Hong Kong right now, and our office in Hong Kong is under renovation. I think we're almost about to officially open our new space, which is very exciting. But it's in the same building where we were before. So if you've been to Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, you don't have to go someplace new. You just have to, hopefully we'll have a sign on the elevator bank. We're on the 11th and 19th floor of a small office building in Sheung Wan, which is a section of Hong Kong on the Hong Kong island. Asia Art Archive in America was founded in 2009 for a number of reasons. And is an independently established and operated US 501c3 and the first overseas hub of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. As we said before, we also have an office in Delhi, India, which please, if anyone's coming in from Delhi or going there, please meet our colleagues, a fabulous group of people there. John, we can go on to the next. Brooklyn we are in Brooklyn Heights, and I urge or encourage the students of Cooper Union to join us. We are open to the public 5 days a week. We have workshops and screenings and conversations. For example, last night we just did a wonderful conversation on site and in person with Hure An, a Singaporean artist. It was a screening, and then after the screening, there was a conversation with Murtaza Vali, a wonderful curator of art whose work I admire very much. And that was a great event. Here's a workshop that we did with a queer performance artist, Sin Wai Kin, who is now based from Vancouver, of Chinese descent, and now based in London, I think.
Yes.
And then the next, let's see what we have next. Oh, this was a great event. It was a dinner prepared by Red Flower Collective. It was open to the public free of charge. And all the recipes that they made were found in the archive. Next. This is a recent event, again, at our space, which is right here where I am, about collectivity. As John said, one of our content priorities, independent art spaces. I'd like to broaden that out and think about collectivity and the independent activities that happen in those spaces. Again, this was with 3 different independent art spaces, one of which was in Malaysia, but the other 2 in New York, and Eugenie Tsai, the curator of the Brooklyn Museum, moderated that. Next. And Leadership Camp. Leadership Camp is in some ways how we connect to a community here. What we like to say is Asia Art Archive in America focuses on recent art in and of Asia. And this is where the coming together of Asian art in America, art by Asians, as I prefer to say, in Asia. Asia Art Archive started out focusing on art in Asia. And when we set up Asia Art Archive in America, the purview of it expanded and reflected and responded to interest in the United States of Asians who were in the United States, who've come here for university or for temporary stays. Maybe we'll think about immigrating at some point in the future, and then Asian Americans, so Asians in Asia and Asians in the US and Asian American. And this leadership camp that we have, it's in our 6th year, and it is by open call, and I urge people to look out for it. We're started by Chris Ho, who's now the director of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, and looking at issues around systems, institutionalization, gender, race, through more or less, whatever that means, an Asian lens. Next. This is the archive when we were nice and clean and new. We have lots of books. We encourage you to come. Some of the books I think are in the next slide. We have reference books, we have exhibition catalogs, we have monographs, and we have artist books and zines. We have quite an active zine, and a lot of people actually come in for our zine collection, and a lot of the zines were produced in Hong Kong during the most active or volatile protest moments in 2019. So the next, please come visit us. And we're on 23 Cranberry Street. And this is our website, and we have a team of wonderful people, Christina and Ko and Furen Dai, who would be delighted to help you look at books and talk to you about issues that maybe you can explore at the archive. Thank you.